My brother had been sleeping with his bride's sister for 6 months. He sent a text the morning of the wedding that said, "One more day of pretending." I was standing near the ice sculpture at my brother David's wedding reception when my new sister-in-law's best friend, Sarah, tapped my shoulder. The music was deafening. Everyone was dancing and drinking champagne. David had just married Elena, a woman he had been dating for 2 years. The ice sculpture was a massive swan. It was already melting under the heat of the banquet lights, dripping onto the white linen tablecloth. I was watching the water pool around the base, swirling a warm scotch in my glass, and Sarah's hand hit my shoulder, hard. Sarah leaned in close. She told me we needed to talk outside immediately. She looked pale and terrified. Her mascara was slightly smudged, but it wasn't from crying at the ceremony. She looked like she had just seen a car crash. I followed her out to the patio overlooking the golf course. The heavy glass doors shut behind us, cutting the bass of the music down to a dull thud. The cool night air hit my face. It smelled like wet grass and expensive cigar smoke from some of the groomsmen who had been out here earlier. I asked her what was wrong. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. She was wearing a thin navy blue bridesmaid dress and shivering, though it wasn't that cold. She said David had been sleeping with Elena's younger sister, Maya, for the last 6 months. I stared at her. The words did not make sense. They didn't fit into the reality of the day. Elena and Maya were incredibly close. They shared an apartment for 3 years after college. Maya was the maid of honor. She had given a tearful, glowing speech an hour ago about how David was the brother she never had. David was my older brother. He was the golden child. He was an investment banker who did everything right. He paid off our parents' mortgage. He drove a Porsche. He was the guy who always picked up the check and made sure everyone knew he picked it up. He curated his life like a museum exhibit. Fucking his fiance's sister didn't fit the exhibit. I asked her if she was completely sure. I told her that was a heavy accusation to throw around at a wedding reception. Sarah pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it on the concrete patio. She said Maya got drunk in the bridal suite an hour ago and confessed everything. Maya had been drinking straight tequila while the rest of the bridal party was taking photos. She broke down. She showed Sarah the messages. Sarah had quickly taken screenshots and sent them to her own phone before Maya sobered up and realized what she had done. She handed me her phone. The screen was cracked in the corner, but the images were crystal clear. I started scrolling. There were dozens of messages. Messages about hotel rooms, specifically room 412 at the Marriott downtown, Tuesday afternoon, Thursday morning before work. Messages making fun of Elena's wedding dress. Maya had sent a picture of Elena trying on a dress back in April, and David had replied that it made her look like a girl, followed by a text saying he preferred how Maya looked at her. Then I saw the text from yesterday morning. David had sent it at 7:15 a.m. It said, "One more day of pretending, and then I will figure out how to get us out of this." I read that line 3 times. He didn't just cheat, he was plotting. He went through with a $50,000 wedding, stood in front of 200 people, and looked Elena in the eyes and promised her his life, all while telling her sister it was a temporary inconvenience. I felt like I was going to throw up. The scotch burned in my stomach. I handed the phone back to Sarah. I told her to wait outside. She asked me what I was going to do. I didn't answer her. I walked back into the ballroom. The air conditioning hit me. It smelled like roasted prime rib and heavily perfumed lilies. The lights were low. The DJ was playing a slow song. It was Ed Sheeran. David and Elena were in the center of the dance floor. Elena had her head resting on his shoulder. Her eyes were closed. She looked incredibly happy. David was looking over her head, scanning the room. He wasn't lost in the moment. He was working the crowd with his eyes. He caught my eye and winked. It was the wink that did it. The sheer, arrogant confidence of it. I walked straight to the DJ booth. It was set up on a small riser near the head table. The DJ was a guy in his 20s wearing a vest and headphones around his neck. He was tapping a beat on the table. I handed the DJ a $100 bill from my wallet. I told him to cut the music and turn the house lights on. He hesitated. He looked at the bill, then at the dance floor, then at me. He said he couldn't do that. The bride and groom were having a moment. I put my hand flat on his soundboard. I told him if he didn't do it, I was going to pull the power cord out of the wall. The music stopped abruptly. The silence was absolute and jarring. A second later, the bright fluorescent house lights snapped on, blinding everyone. The warm romantic ambiance was instantly replaced by the harsh, clinical lighting of a hotel conference room. The crowd groaned in confusion. People stopped dancing. Glasses clinked as people lowered their drinks. I walked over to David and Elena. The floor felt incredibly long. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me. I ignored the confused looks from our parents, who were sitting at a table near the front. My mother was already half out of her chair, a forced, polite smile on her face, ready to smooth over whatever technical difficulty was happening. I looked at David. I told him we needed to go to the bridal suite right now. David laughed nervously. He squeezed Elena's waist. He asked what was going on and tried to play it off as a joke. He looked at the crowd and said, "Looks like my little brother had a bit too much to drink." A few people chuckled politely. I stepped closer to him. I dropped my voice so only he and Elena could hear. I told him I knew about Maya. His smile vanished instantly. It was like a switch flipped. The color drained from his face. His eyes darted toward the exit, calculating the distance. He dropped his arm from Elena's waist. He tried to grab her hand to walk away, to lead her off the floor, but I stepped in front of him. I looked at Elena. She looked beautiful and entirely confused. I told her she needed to ask her sister to see her text messages. Elena looked back and forth between David and me. She asked what I was talking about. Her voice was quiet. David immediately started talking over me. The panic was bleeding into his voice now. He raised his voice and told Elena I was just jealous and trying to ruin his big day. He said I was drunk and making things up. He reached out and shoved my shoulder. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was aggressive. He told me to back the fuck off. Maya suddenly walked out of the bathroom near the bar. She had a damp paper towel in her hand. She froze when she saw the 3 of us standing in the middle of the silent dance floor, with everyone watching. She looked from me to David to Elena. David saw her. He pointed at me and yelled that I was insane. He demanded that security escort me out. He was projecting to the back of the room now, trying to control the narrative. "Get him out of here! He's ruined the reception!" I did not move. I didn't look at David. I looked right at Maya. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. I asked her if she wanted to show Elena the texts, or if I should ask Sarah to do it. Maya broke. She didn't try to lie. She didn't try to run. She burst into tears. She covered her face with her hands, dropping the paper towel on the polished wood floor, and collapsed into a chair at the nearest empty table. Elena dropped David's hand. The confusion in her eyes shifted to something else. Horror. Realization. She walked over to Maya. Her heavy dress rustled against the floorboards. She stood over her sister. She asked her if it was true. Her voice cracked on the last word. Maya just sobbed louder. She kept her face buried in her hands and nodded her head. The ballroom erupted into chaos. It wasn't a gradual swell of noise. It was an explosion. Elena's father, Arthur, was a retired contractor. He was a big man. He lunged at David. He didn't say a word. He just went for his throat. 2 groomsmen groomsmen, friends of David's from his frat days, grabbed Arthur by the shoulders and held him back. Arthur was dragging them across the floor, his face purple, screaming that he was going to kill him. My mother started screaming. Not words, just a high-pitched wail of pure denial. My father was frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the table. David looked around the room. He saw Arthur fighting the groomsmen. He saw Maya sobbing. He saw Sarah walking back in from the patio, holding her phone up like a piece of evidence. He realized the charade was completely over. There was no spinning this. There was no PR move that could save it. He did not look sorry. He looked annoyed. He smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo jacket. He adjusted his cuffs. He looked at Elena, who was staring at him like he was a stranger who had just broken into her house. He told her it was not a big deal. He actually said those words. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. He said it was just a physical thing. He said the wedding stress got to him, and he made a stupid mistake, and she was overreacting in front of everyone. He told her to calm down and they could talk about it privately. I didn't think about what I was going to do next. I just did it. I grabbed David by the collar of his expensive tuxedo. I got a fistful of the jacket and his dress shirt. I dragged him backward. He weighed maybe 160 pounds. I had 50 pounds on him and I worked construction. He didn't stand a chance. I pulled him toward the heavy double doors leading to the lobby. He struggled. He tried to pry my fingers off his collar. He kicked backward, his shiny dress shoes scraping against the floor. I kept walking. I dragged him past the head table, past the melting swan ice sculpture, past our mother who was now clutching her chest. I shoved him through the doors into the empty hallway. The lobby was quiet. The carpet was thick and absorbed the sound of our feet. He stumbled and caught his balance against the brass luggage cart. His jacket was ripped at the seam. His bow tie was hanging by a thread. He glared at me. His face was twisted in ugly, defensive rage. He asked me what my problem was. He asked me why I would do this in front of everyone. He said brothers were supposed to cover for each other. He said I was a loser who just wanted to drag him down to my level. I looked at him. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt disgusted. He wasn't a man. He was a hollow shell of a person who only cared about how things looked, not what they were. I told him he was a coward and a fraud. I didn't wait for a response. I stepped back into the ballroom. I grabbed the heavy brass handles of the double doors. I pulled them shut. I heard the heavy deadbolt click into place. I locked him out of his own wedding reception. David started pounding on the doors from the outside. The heavy wood muffled the sound, but you could hear him shouting. He was demanding to be let back in. He was yelling for our father. He was yelling for his groomsmen. Nobody moved to open them. The groomsmen who had held Arthur back just stood there, looking at the floor. My father didn't get up. Elena was sitting on the floor now, surrounded by her bridesmaids. The skirt of her dress was spread out around her like a deflated parachute. She wasn't wailing like my mother. She was crying quietly, her hands pressed flat against the floor. Maya was gone. She had run out the side exit. I walked over to the bar. The bartender was standing with a bottle of vodka in one hand, completely frozen. I asked him for a glass of water. He poured it mechanically and handed it to me. I walked over to Elena. I knelt down. I didn't try to hug her. I didn't tell her everything was going to be okay, because it wasn't. I just handed her the water. She took it. Her hands were shaking so badly the water spilled over the edge and soaked into the tool of her dress. She didn't drink it. She just held it. David pounded on the door for another 10 minutes. The thumping echoed through the silent room. People started gathering their coats. Guests were whispering, avoiding eye contact with anyone from either family. The caterers quietly started clearing plates from the tables. Eventually, the pounding stopped. Through the glass panels flanking the doors, I saw 2 hotel security guards escorting David down the hallway. He was arguing with them, pointing back at the doors, but they kept him moving. They escorted him off the property. I stayed at the venue until 2 a.m. I helped Elena's father pack up the gifts. We didn't speak to each other. We just loaded boxes into the back of his SUV. My parents left without saying a word to me. My mother looked at me as she walked out, and the look in her eyes was pure hatred. Not for David, for me. I had broken the illusion, and to her, that was the unforgivable sin. Elena filed for an annulment the next morning. It was swift and brutal. She moved out of the condo she shared with David before noon. She hired movers and took everything she owned while David was sitting in a hotel room downtown. David tried to spin it, of course. He spent the next 3 weeks calling our extended family, telling them Elena was mentally unstable. He said the texts were faked by Sarah, who had always hated him. He said I was in on it because I was jealous of his success. It worked on some of them. It worked on my parents. My parents still will not speak to me. My father sent me a text a week after the wedding saying I had destroyed the family, and he needed time to process my betrayal. My mother blocked my number. They still have Sunday dinners with David. They choose to believe his version of reality because it's easier than accepting they raised a sociopath. I do not care. I still live in my apartment. I still work my job. A few months ago, I got a text from Elena. It was just a picture of a coffee cup on a table overlooking a beach somewhere warm. No words, just proof of life, proof that she survived it. I didn't reply. I just deleted the picture and went to work. I don't need my family to agree with me. I know what was on that phone. I know what happened in that room. And I know that if I had to do it again, I wouldn't hesitate for a second. 8 months went by. It was late November, a Tuesday. The heating pipes in my apartment were clanking the way they always do when the temperature drops below freezing. I was eating a bowl of chili on my couch and watching a hockey game on TV. The intercom buzzed. It was 8:45 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked over and pressed the button. I asked who it was. The speaker was full of static, but I recognized the voice immediately. It was my father. He asked me to let him in. He said it was freezing outside. I pressed the release button. I stood by my front door and listened to his heavy footsteps coming up the 2 flights of stairs. When I opened the door, he looked 10 years older than the last time I saw him sitting at that wedding reception table. He was wearing his heavy gray wool coat. His shoulders were slumped. He had lost weight. The collar of his shirt looked 2 sizes too big for his neck. He smelled like wet wool, stale coffee, and exhaust fumes. He stepped inside and looked around my apartment. He had never been here. He and my mother always insisted I come to their 4-bedroom house in the suburbs for holidays or dinners. My place wasn't nice enough for them. He asked if he could sit down. I pointed to the armchair across from the couch. I didn't offer him a drink. I didn't offer to take his coat. I sat back down on the couch and waited. He sat on the edge of the chair. He kept his hands clasped between his knees. He stared at my coffee table for a long time before he spoke. He told me David was gone. For a second, I thought he meant dead. I didn't feel a spike of panic or grief. I just felt a cold, clinical curiosity. I asked him what he meant. My father took a shaky breath. He said David had left the state. He cleared out his bank accounts, packed his clothes into a duffel bag, and got on a plane to Florida 3 days ago. He didn't tell them he was leaving. He just left a note on their kitchen counter. I asked him why David was living at their house. My father closed his eyes. The dam broke. The perfect, curated reality my parents had built around their golden child completely collapsed right there in my living room. David had lost his job at the investment bank 3 weeks after the wedding. Elena's uncle was a senior partner at a commercial real estate firm that did millions of dollars in business with David's bank. Elena's father, Arthur, had made a few phone calls. The bank let David go quietly. No severance, no recommendations, just a cardboard box and an escort to the elevator. David didn't tell my parents. Of course he didn't. He couldn't handle the shame of not being the success story anymore. Instead, he kept up the routine. For 5 months, he put on a suit every morning and left his condo. He sat in coffee shops. He went to the gym, and to maintain his lifestyle, the Porsche lease, the expensive dinners, the $1,000 suits, he started borrowing money. He went to my parents first. He told them he had an insider tip on a tech startup. He needed $80,000 for the original. He promised them a massive return. My parents, desperate to keep believing in his genius, took out a second mortgage on their house to give him the cash. He burned through it in 3 months. Then he maxed out credit cards in my name. He had convinced her to co-sign on them years ago to build her credit score. By the time the bank finally seized his condo and repossessed his car, he was in the hole for nearly $150,000. When he had nothing left to sell and no more credit to burn, he moved back into his childhood home. He told my parents it was temporary. Then, 3 days ago, the collection agencies started calling the house. My father found the mail David had been hiding. Final notices, lawsuits. My father looked up at me. His eyes were red and wet. He wasn't crying, but he was close. He told me they were going to lose the house. The bank was initiating foreclosure at the end of the month. Their retirement savings were gone. They had nothing left. I looked at the man sitting in my chair. He looked pathetic, but I remembered the text message he sent me the week after the wedding. I remembered him telling me I had destroyed the family. I remembered my mother's eyes when she walked out of the hotel lobby. I asked him why he was telling me all of this. He swallowed hard. He looked at the floor again. He said he knew I had been putting money away since I started working construction. He knew I lived cheaply. He asked if I had enough saved to cover the arrears on their mortgage, just to stop the foreclosure. He said they would pay me back. He said they just needed time to sell the house on their own terms. He finally looked me in the eye. He used the word. He said, "We're family." I didn't yell. I didn't laugh. I just looked at him with the same blank expression I had been wearing since he walked in. I told him I had $70,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account. I had been saving it for a down payment on a house of my own. His eyes lit up for a fraction of a second. Relief washed over his face. He started to sit up straighter. He started to reach a hand out toward me. I told him I wasn't giving him a single dime. His hand dropped. The relief vanished, replaced instantly by the old familiar anger, the defense mechanism. He raised his voice. He told me they were my parents. He told me they raised me. He asked how I could be so selfish when they were about to be out on the street. I leaned forward. I rested my elbows on my knees. I kept my voice low and steady. I told him they weren't losing their house because of bad luck. They were losing it because they chose a liar over the truth. They chose the son who looked good in a tuxedo over the son who tried to protect them from a sociopath. I told him he didn't come here to apologize for cutting me out of his life. He came here because his ATM was broken and he thought he could use me as a backup. He stared at me. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. There was no argument he could make. There was no spin he could put on it. The facts were just sitting there on the table between us, heavy and immutable. I stood up. I walked to the front door and opened it. The cold air from the stairwell drifted into the apartment. I told him it was time for him to go. He stood up slowly. He looked small. He walked toward the door, his heavy coat dragging around his knees. He stopped in the doorway and looked at me one last time. He looked like he wanted to say something else. Maybe he wanted to finally apologize. Maybe he wanted to curse me out. He didn't do either. He just walked out into the hall and started down the stairs. I shut the door. I threw the deadbolt. I walked back into the living room. There was a dark, wet stain on the fabric of the armchair where his coat had been resting. I went to the kitchen, got a towel and some club soda, and scrubbed the stain out. Then I sat back down on the couch, unmuted the television, and finished my chili. 4 months after my father came to my apartment, the bank finalized the foreclosure. I didn't go to the auction, but I looked up the public records online. The house my parents had lived in for 30 years, the house I grew up in, sold for 70 cents on the dollar to a corporate property management firm. My parents moved into a rented 2-bedroom apartment near the airport. The flight paths rattled their windows every 15 minutes. I heard that through an aunt I still occasionally spoke to. She told me my mother was working part-time at a floral shop to help pay for groceries. My father had taken a job as a greeter at a big box hardware store. They never reached out to me again. I didn't reach out to them. I bought my own house that same spring. It wasn't a mansion. It was a single-story brick ranch on a quarter acre, built in the late 70s. It needed a new roof, and the plumbing was shot, but the foundation was solid. I spent my savings on the down payment and used the rest for materials. I spent my evenings and weekends gutting the place. I pulled up rotted carpets and laid down hardwood. I patched drywall and rerouted pipes. I like the work. When you hit a nail, it drives in. When you cut a board, it fits. If a joint is weak, the weight breaks it. There is no pretending in carpentry. It holds up or it collapses. It was early May when David finally showed up. I was at my house, working on the front porch. I was covered in sawdust and sweat, prying up rotten floorboards with a heavy iron crowbar. The sun was hot for a spring afternoon. A silver Nissan Altima pulled into my driveway. The front bumper was held on by gray duct tape. The muffler rattled loudly against the pavement before the engine abruptly cut off. The driver's door opened. It was David. He didn't look like the guy on the dance floor. He was sunburned, but not the wealthy, weekend in Cabo kind of burn. It was a patchy, peeling red. He had grown a beard, probably to hide the puffiness in his face and jawline. He was wearing faded jeans and a thin polo shirt with a grease stain near the hem. He looked 10 years older than 32. He walked up the driveway. He looked at my house. He didn't make a passive-aggressive comment about the neighborhood or the size of the yard. He just looked exhausted. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I didn't stop working. I wedged the crowbar under a warped pine board and leaned my weight on it. The wood splintered and popped loose with a loud crack. He said my name. His voice was hoarse. I dropped the board onto the discard pile in the yard. I picked up the crowbar and looked down at him. He didn't try to charm me. He didn't put on the fake golden boy smile. He stared at the steel toes of my work boots and said things hadn't worked out in Florida. The guy he went down there to partner with turned out to be a scam artist who drained the last of his cash. He had been sleeping in the Altima in a Walmart parking lot for 3 weeks. He asked if he could stay in my spare room just for a month, just until he got a job and got back on his feet. I looked at him, my older brother, the investment banker, the guy who drove a Porsche and bought $600 bottles of champagne. He was standing in my driveway begging for a place to sleep. I thought about Elena sitting on the floor in her wedding dress, staring at a glass of water. I thought about the text message he sent Maya. One more day of pretending. I thought about my father asking for my life savings to cover David's theft. I asked him if he had talked to mom and dad. He flinched. He shook his head, looking at the ground. He said he couldn't. He said he knew what he did to them, and he couldn't look them in the eye. He said I was the only one who knew the real him anyway, so I was the only one he could come to. He actually thought that was a compliment. He thought acknowledging his own ugliness to me created some kind of bond between us. He thought being a parasite made us brothers. I pulled my leather work gloves off. I wiped the sweat off my forehead with the back of my arm. I told him no. He didn't yell. The fight was completely gone out of him. He just nodded slowly, a small, pathetic twitch of his head, like he had already expected the answer before he pulled into the driveway. He asked me for $20 for gas. I reached into my back pocket. I pulled out my wallet. I slid a crisp $20 bill out and handed it down to him. He took it. He didn't say thank you. He turned around, walked back to the Altima, and got in. The engine struggled to turn over, whining for 5 long seconds, but it finally caught. He backed out of my driveway, put the car in drive, and drove away. I watched the car disappear around the corner at the end of the street. The quiet of the neighborhood settled back in. The air smelled like cut pine and damp earth. I put my leather gloves back on, picked up my crowbar, wedged it under the neckboard, and kept working. 3 years went by. I turned 31. I finished the house. I painted the exterior a dark slate gray and rebuilt the front steps with composite decking that wouldn't rot. I paid off the materials on my credit card. I got promoted to site superintendent for the construction firm I worked for. I traded my old truck in for a newer model with a crew cab and a reliable transmission. My life became a straight line. Wake up at 4:30 a.m., drink coffee, drive to the site, manage the crews, check the blueprints, argue with the city inspectors, go home, eat dinner, sleep. It was quiet. It was exactly what I wanted. I never heard from David again. I didn't try to find her. I didn't look up my parents either. The space they used to occupy in my life just scarred over and became numb tissue. It was a Tuesday in early November. The anniversary of the wedding had just passed. Not that I marked it on the calendar. We were doing a massive commercial film downtown, retrofitting an old warehouse into office spaces. The weather had turned bitterly cold overnight. The wind coming off the river was biting. At 10 a.m., the plumbing contractor realized he was short on 3-inch copper couplings. I told him I would make a run to the plumbing supply house on the edge of the industrial district so he could keep his crew moving. I parked my truck in the gravel lot of the supply house. The building was a massive crafty steel hangar that smelled like machine oil and coal dust. The radio was playing classic rock at a low volume. One was an older guy with a gray mustache, cutting a length of PVC pipe. The other was a woman entering inventory into a computer terminal. She was wearing a thick red fleece jacket with the company logo embroidered on the chest. Her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail. She looked up when the bell on the door chimed. It was Maya. She froze. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. She looked entirely different from the girl in the silk bridesmaid dress. The expensive highlights in her hair had grown out into dull brown roots. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked tired, deeply, fundamentally tired. I walked up to the counter. I didn't turn around and leave. I had a job to do. I put my materials list on the scratched laminate counter between us. I told her I needed a dozen 3-inch copper sweat couplings and a roll of solder. She stared at me. Her mouth opened slightly, but she didn't speak. She looked at the paper, then back at my face. She was searching for something. Anger, maybe, or pity. I didn't give her either. I just looked at her, waiting for my parts. She swallowed hard. She looked down at the paper. Her hands were shaking just a little bit as she picked it up. She didn't say a word. She turned around and walked down an aisle of tall metal shelving. I stood there and listened to the low hum of the fluorescent lights. The older guy at the other register glanced at me, then went back to his PVC pipe. A minute later, Maya came back. She was carrying a small cardboard box. She set it on the counter. She scanned the barcode on the side of the box with a hand scanner. It beeped loudly. She looked at the computer screen. She told me it was $84.20. Her voice was raspy. I pulled out the company credit card and handed it to her. She swiped it. She handed it back with a printed receipt. I signed the receipt and pushed it across the counter. I picked up the box. I started to turn away, but she spoke. She asked if I ever talked to him. I stopped. I didn't have to ask who she meant. She kept her eyes fixed on the laminate counter. She said David had blocked her number the night of the wedding. He never answered her calls. He never gave her an explanation. He just vanished and left her to face Elena alone. She said Elena hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. Her parents had stopped inviting her to Thanksgiving. She said she lost everything because of him. She finally looked up at me. Her eyes were red. She wanted me to give her closure. She wanted me to tell her David was suffering, or that he was a monster, or something that would make her feel like a victim instead of an accomplice. I shifted the cardboard box to my left hand. I told her David didn't make her sleep with her sister's fiance. I told her she lost everything because of her own choices, and she needed to stop blaming a ghost for the bed she made. She flinched like I had slapped her. The redness in her eyes spilled over into a single tear that tracked down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just stared at me. I turned around and walked out of the supply house. The wind hit me as soon as I pushed the heavy metal door open. It felt good. It was freezing, but it was clean. I threw the box of couplings onto the passenger seat of my truck, climbed in, and started the engine. I put it in gear and drove back to the job site. I didn't think about Maya for the rest of the day. I thought about the concrete pour scheduled for Thursday. I thought about the framing inspection. I stayed at the site until the sun went down and the floodlights clicked on. I drove home at 6:30 p.m. I pulled into my driveway. The motion sensor light above the garage clicked on, illuminating the dark slate siding and the clean lines of the porch I had built with my own 2 hands. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was warm. The thermostat was set to 68 degrees. The oak floors I had laid down gleamed in the ambient light from the street lamps outside. There were no voices. There were no arguments. There were no lies hiding in the walls. I took off my work boots and set them on the rubber mat by the door. I walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a bottle of beer. I popped the cap off with the edge of the granite countertop. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. I took a long drink of the cold beer. I looked around the quiet, solid room. I had built this life brick by brick, board by board. It was entirely mine. I turned on the television, set the volume to low, and didn't think about my brother ever again. I didn't think about him again for exactly 4 years and 2 months. I was 35. It was mid-January. The ground was frozen solid under 6 inches of hard-packed snow. I was in my office at the commercial site, running numbers for a massive steel order when my cell phone rang. The caller ID was a local number I didn't recognize. I answered it. A woman on the other end asked for me by my full legal name. She said she was calling from the county medical examiner's office. She told me my father was dead. He had collapsed in the break room of the hardware store where he worked. Massive coronary. He was dead before the paramedics got the defibrillator pads on his chest. She asked if I was his next of kin. I told her I supposed I was. She gave me an address downtown and told me I needed to come identify the body and sign the release paperwork. I hung up. I looked at the spreadsheet on my monitor. I saved the file, closed the laptop, and put on my heavy winter coat. I didn't tell my crew where I was going. I just got in my truck and drove downtown. The morgue was in the basement of the county hospital. It smelled like bleach, floor wax, and ozone. A tired-looking man in green scrubs led me into a room with a stainless steel table. He pulled back a heavy plastic sheet. It was my father. He looked incredibly small. His skin was gray, and his mouth was slightly open. The lines on his face were deeper than I remembered. He looked like a man who had spent the last decade of his life carrying a heavy stone up a very steep hill. The man in the scrubs asked if it was him. I nodded. I signed a clipboard with a cheap plastic pen. A hospital social worker met me in the hallway outside. She handed me a manila envelope containing my father's personal effects, a cheap Timex watch with a cracked leather band, a wedding ring, a worn brown wallet, a set of keys on a plain brass ring. She asked about my mother. I told her they were living in an apartment near the airport, but I hadn't spoken to them in over 4 years. The social worker looked down at her tablet. She tapped the screen a few times. She looked up at me with professional, practiced sympathy. She told me my mother had passed away 14 months ago, pancreatic cancer. She had died in a state-funded hospice facility 2 counties over. I stood in the sterile hallway and absorbed the information. My mother had gotten sick, withered away, and died, and my father had buried her without ever picking up the phone to tell me. His pride, or his shame, was stronger than whatever was left of our family. The social worker asked if there was anyone else she needed to contact. A sibling, maybe? I looked at the plastic bag holding my father's wallet. I said no. I was the only one left. I hired a direct cremation service to handle the body. I didn't organize a memorial. I didn't publish an obituary in the local paper. There was nobody to invite. 2 days later, I used the keys from the manila envelope to open the door to my father's apartment. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a brick complex backed up directly against the perimeter fence of the regional airport. As I put the key in the lock, a commercial jet took off. The noise was deafening. It violently rattled the metal handrail on the stairs and vibrated in my teeth. I walked inside. The apartment smelled like stale coffee, dust, and cheap pine cleaner. It was dark. I flipped the light switch. The place was entirely sparse. There was a stained brown couch, a small box television sitting on a folding table, and a single armchair. There were no pictures on the walls. There was no rug on the peeling linoleum floor. It looked like a waiting room for a purgatory no one ever leaves. I walked into the kitchen. There was a stack of unopened mail on the laminate counter, mostly utility bills and final collection notices. I walked into the bedroom. A single twin bed, perfectly made with a thin blue blanket. My mother's side of the room was entirely empty. All her clothes, her perfume, her jewelry gone, sold or thrown away. In the corner of the bedroom was a cheap particle board desk. I sat down in the plastic chair in front of it and opened the top drawer. It was full of Western Union receipts. There had to be over 200 of them, bundled together with thick rubber bands. I picked up the top stack and snapped the rubber band off. The dry rubber broke and stung my thumb. I started flipping through the thin, yellowed slips of paper. $50 sent to a Walmart in Phoenix, Arizona. $30 sent to a check cashing place in Reno, Nevada. $60 sent to a grocery store in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The names on the receiving end varied. Sometimes it was David's real name. Sometimes it was Dave Miller or D. Vance. But the sender was always my father. The dates spanned the last 4 years. The most recent receipt was dated 3 days before my father died in the break room. It was for $45, sent to a gas station in El Paso, Texas. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk. There was a single battered box. I took the lid off. Inside was a stack of photographs. They were all of David. David graduating high school. David in his college fraternity composites. David standing next to his leased Porsche. David and Elena at their engagement party. There were no pictures of me. There were no pictures of my mother. Just the golden child, preserved in glossy print. Underneath the photos was a letter. It was written on lined notebook paper, folded in thirds. The handwriting was messy and hurried. I recognized it immediately. It was David's. The letter wasn't dated, but the paper was crisp. Dad, I need another 200. My radiator cracked and I can't move the car. If I don't move the car, they'll tow it and then I'm on the street. Stop telling me to call him. I'm never going back to that state and I'm never asking him for a dime. He ruined my life. He took Elena from me. He took my job. He took my reputation. You own me. He raised a sociopath and destroyed his own brother over a misunderstanding. Send the money to the usual spot in El Paso by Friday. David, I read the letter twice. He still believed it. After all the lost jobs, the repossessed cars, the burned bridges, and the literal cross-country drift into poverty, he still genuinely believed I was the villain. He had spent the last 7 years convincing himself that I was the reason he couldn't keep his pants zipped and his ego in check. And my father was like a delusion until his heart literally stopped beating. He bled his minimum wage paychecks dry to subsidize a lie. I put the letter back in the shoebox. I put the lid on it. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt an overwhelming sense of waste. 3 lives entirely consumed by the desperate need to pretend. I went out to my truck. I grabbed a box of heavy-duty black contractor bags from the bed. I brought them back up to the apartment. I spent the next 4 hours throwing my father's life into the black plastic. I threw away the cheap clothes. I threw away the unwashed coffee mugs. I threw away the bundled Western Union receipts. When I got to the shoebox, I didn't open it again. I just dropped it into the bottom of a bag and covered it with a pile of old newspapers and junk mail. I hauled the heavy bags down the stairs and threw them into the complex's industrial dumpster. The heavy metal lid slammed shut with a loud, hollow bang. I went back upstairs one last time. I locked the door and slipped the key under the welcome mat for the landlord to find. I walked down to my truck. The sun was setting, casting long, cold shadows across the frozen asphalt. Another plane took off, roaring into the gray winter sky, shaking the ground under my boots. I climbed into the cab. I turned the key, and the heavy diesel engine rumbled to life. I turned the heater on high and sat there for a minute, letting the warmth soak into my frozen hands. I put the truck in drive and pulled out of the parking lot. I drove back across town, away from the airport, away from the hospital, away from the ghosts. I drove until I pulled into my own driveway. My house was dark and quiet. The slate gray siding looked solid against the snow. The foundation I had repaired was holding firm. I walked up the composite steps. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. I locked the deadbolt behind me, took off my boots, and turned on the lights. I had kept my father's cell phone. It was in the manila envelope the hospital social worker had given me. It was a cheap prepaid Android with a cracked plastic screen. I only kept it to pull the account numbers for his utilities and to cancel his auto insurance. I left it plugged into a charger on my kitchen island. It rang on a Friday afternoon, 10 days after I cleaned out the apartment. I had just gotten home from the site. I was washing mortar off my hands in the kitchen sink. The phone buzzed and vibrated against the granite countertop. I dried my hands on a towel and walked over. The screen illuminated. It was an incoming call from a 915 area code, El Paso. I picked it up and swiped the green button. I pressed the phone to my ear. I didn't say anything. Where the fuck is it? David's voice sounded thin and metallic through the cheap speaker. He was talking fast, breathless. There was a noise in the background. I've been standing at the Western Union counter at this goddamn pilot station for 2 hours. The guy says there's no transfer under my name. I told you I needed it today. The manager here is calling the cops if I don't move the car. Did you send it to the wrong store again? He paused, waiting for an apology from an old man who was already turned back. I looked out my kitchen window. The snow in my backyard was starting to melt, revealing the dead brown grass underneath. I spoke. He's dead. The line went completely silent. The traffic noise in the background kept humming, but David stopped breathing. He didn't ask how. He didn't ask when. He didn't ask if our mother was okay. He didn't ask if I was okay. The first words out of his mouth, after 10 seconds of dead air, were a panicked whisper. What about the house? He was doing the math. He thought there was an estate. He thought there was a payout coming that would save him. There is no house, I told him. My voice was entirely flat. The bank took it 4 years ago because of the loans he took out for you. His life insurance then, David said. His voice was rising now. It was shrill. He had a policy through the union, 50,000. I know he did. He cashed it out, I said. 3 years ago. He sent it to you in Reno and Phoenix and Albuquerque. He died in the break room of a hardware store making $12 an hour. You're lying. I have the receipts, David. Hundreds of them. I threw them in a dumpster. You can't do that, he screamed. The mask was completely off. He sounded like a feral animal backed into a corner. You can't just take it. I'm the oldest. Half of whatever he had belongs to me. You owe me that money. I let him yell. I listened to the absolute desperation in his voice. This was the golden child. The investment banker who wore $1,000 suits and winked at me on the dance floor while he destroyed his own life. Now he was screaming into a burner phone in a Texas gas station, begging for scraps from a dead man's empty wallet. There is no money, David, I said. There is no estate. There is no inheritance. He died with $82 in his checking account. You bled him dry. You took everything he had, and then you killed him. Fuck you! You did this! He sobbed. He was actually crying now. Ugly, gasping sobs. If you had just kept your fucking mouth shut at the wedding, none of this would have happened. I had a career. I had Elena. You ruined my life. It was exactly what he had written in the letter. It was the only reality he had left to cling to. I didn't argue with him. I didn't try to make him see the truth. You can't explain the sunlight to a man who refuses to open his eyes. Don't call this number again, I said. Wait, please, he begged. The anger vanished, replaced by sheer terror. My car won't start. I haven't eaten since yesterday. Just send me 200 just to get the car fixed. Please, you're my brother. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at the cracked screen. I found the red button. I tapped it. The call disconnected. I didn't block the number. I powered the phone down entirely. I took a flathead screwdriver from the drawer next to the sink spring, pried the plastic casing off the back of the phone, and snapped the SIM card in half. I threw the pieces into the trash bin. Spring came early that year. In April, the mountains of August leafed, and the trees lining my street were thick with green buds. I started a new project on my house. I decided to build a detached workshop in the backyard. I poured the concrete slab myself on a Saturday morning. I leveled it, smoothed it out, and watched the water flow and evaporate on the surface as it cured. I hired a young guy from my crew to come over and help me frame the walls. We worked until the sun went down, listening to the radio and drinking cheap beer. We put up the trusses. We nailed down the roof decking. When he left, I stayed out in the yard. I sat on the tailgate of my truck and looked at the skeleton of the building. The wood smelled like pine and sap. It was sturdy. It was plumb. If a storm came, it would stand. I thought about David one last time. I pictured him sitting in a broken down Altima somewhere in the desert, telling anyone who would listen about the terrible brother who stole his perfect life. He will spend the rest of his days building castles out of lies and wondering why they keep collapsing on top of him. I took a final sip of my beer. The bottle was cold against my palm. I got off the tailgate, walked across my solid yard, and went inside my quiet house. I locked the heavy door behind me, and I went to sleep. The quiet lasted for 14 months. I was 36. It was late summer, the kind of hot that bakes the moisture out of the air and leaves the ground cracked and hard. I came home from a job site on a Thursday evening. I checked the mail at the end of my driveway. Amidst the junk mail and utility bills was a thick, rigid envelope. It was certified mail. The return address was a law firm based in Phoenix, Arizona. I walked into my kitchen, threw my keys on the counter, and tore the top off the envelope. It was a notice of default and intent to sue. The document stated that I owed $46,000 on a defaulted auto loan for a 2023 Ford F-250. The loan had been taken out 9 months prior. The dealership was in Tucson. No payments had ever been made. My full legal name was on the header. My social security number was printed near the bottom, with only the last 4 digits visible. They matched. I set the paper down on the granite countertop. I didn't panic. I just traced the timeline backward in my head. When David moved back into my parents' house after he lost his job, he was there for 5 months. He had free reign of the place. My father kept all the old tax returns, birth certificates, and financial records in a locked metal filing cabinet in the basement, but the key was always kept in the top drawer of his desk. David had 5 months to pull my file, copy my numbers, and hold on to them like an insurance policy. When my father died and the Western Union money dried up, David finally cashed the policy in. He didn't just steal my identity to survive. He bought a heavy-duty truck. He was still trying to play the big shot, even while drowning. I poured myself a glass of tap water. I drank it in one long swallow. I had 2 choices. I could hire a lawyer, fight the debt collectors in civil court, and spend tens of thousands of dollars trying to prove it wasn't me who signed those papers. Or I could take the direct route. To clear my name, I had to file an official police report for identity theft. I had to name the suspect. Grand theft auto and wire fraud were felonies. If I filed the report, my brother would go to federal prison. I didn't even have to sit down to think about it. I walked into my home office. I gathered my W-2s, my pay stubs, and my bank statements, proving I was in my home state on the day the truck was purchased in Arizona. I put them in a manila folder, along with the certified letter. I drove down to the local police precinct. The station smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax. I waited 45 minutes on a hard plastic chair before a detective called me back to his desk. His name was Miller. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened and his desk was covered in paper files. I sat down and handed him the manila folder. I told him my identity had been stolen, and I knew exactly who did it. Miller opened the folder. He reviewed the default notice. He looked at my pay stubs. Then he asked for the name of the suspect. I told him it was my older brother, David. Miller stopped writing. He looked up at me over the rim of his glasses. He set his pen down. He told me I needed to understand what I was doing. He said once he entered this into the National Crime Information Center database, a warrant would be issued. It crossed state lines. It was a federal issue now. He said a lot of people come in angry at family members, file a report, and then try to take it back a week later when they realize their brother or son is facing hard time. He told me that if I wasn't entirely committed to pressing charges, I shouldn't waste his time. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him my brother had been dead to me for 6 years. I told him he could put him under the jail for all I cared, as long as a lien didn't touch my house. Miller nodded slowly. He picked up his pen. He took down the information. He asked for David's last known whereabouts. I told him about the phone call from El Paso, Texas, 14 months ago. I gave him the make and model of the silver Nissan Altima David had been driving the last time I saw him. I signed a sworn statement. I walked out of the police station, got in my truck, and went to work the next morning. The gears of the justice system grind incredibly slow. I spent the next 3 months fighting the credit bureaus. I had to freeze my credit, send notarized copies of the police report to 3 different agencies, and argue with collections agents on my lunch breaks. It was tedious, frustrating work. But the debt was eventually suspended pending the fraud investigation. 7 months after I walked into the precinct, my cell phone rang. It was Detective Miller. He asked if I had a few minutes. I was standing on the 2nd floor of a partially framed apartment complex. I told my foreman to take over, walked down the scaffolding, and stood by my truck. Miller told me they got it. It wasn't a dramatic FBI raid. There was no shootout. It was a routine traffic stop on a dusty highway outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. David had a burnt-out taillight. A state trooper pulled him over. When the trooper ran the plates on the F-250, the NCIC hit came back immediately. Stolen vehicle. Felony fraud warrant. They ordered him out of the truck at gunpoint. He was living in the cab. The back seat was piled high with fast food wrappers, dirty clothes, and empty liquor bottles. He didn't fight. He just put his hands on his head and cried. Miller told me David was currently sitting in a county jail in Arizona, awaiting extradition back to our state to face the wire fraud charges. Miller asked me if I wanted him to pass along a message. Sometimes, he said, family members want to set up a phone call or a visitation once the dust settles. I listened to the hum of the diesel generator running on the job site behind me. I looked at the steel framing rising up against the blue sky. I told the detective I had nothing to say to him. 2 months later, I received a subpoena in the mail to appear as a witness for the prosecution. I cleared my schedule. I bought a new suit. I was fully prepared to sit on a wooden stand in a courtroom, look my brother in the eye, and testify exactly how he stole my name. I never got the chance. 3 days before the trial was set to begin, the assistant district attorney called me. He told me the trial was canceled. David had taken a plea deal. He was out of money. He was out of people to manipulate. He had a public defender who looked at the mountain of evidence, the dealership security footage, the forged signatures, the IP addresses from his burner phone, and told him he was going to lose. He pled guilty to 1 count of felony wire fraud and 1 count of identity theft. The ADA told me the judge sentenced him to 48 months in a federal correctional institution. He was being transferred to a medium security facility the following morning. The lawyer thanked me for my cooperation. I hung up the phone. I didn't celebrate. I didn't pour a drink or call a friend. I just took off my work boots and put them by the door. I walked out my back door door and down the steps into my yard. The sun was going down, turning the sky a bruised purple. I walked into the detached workshop I had built. I turned on the overhead fluorescent lights. My tools were lined up on the pegboard. My workbench was clean. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Everything had a purpose. David was going to spend the next 4 years in a concrete box, stripped of his suits, his lies, and his audience. He would be just a number. For a man who spent his entire life obsessing over his image, being reduced to a completely invisible inmate was a fate worse than death. I picked up a piece of rough-cut oak from the scrap pile. I clamped it into the vise on my workbench. I grabbed a hand plane, set the blade, and started pushing it across the surface of the wood. The blade bit into the oak. A thin, perfect sheeting of wood curled up and fell to the floor. The wood underneath was smooth and clean. I pushed the plane again and again. I didn't have a brother anymore. I hadn't had one for a very long time. But for the first time since Sarah tapped my shoulder near that melting ice sculpture, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never have to hear his name again. The debt was erased. The slate was wiped clean. The foundation was finally secure.